should a different priority arise. It would pool the risk of uncertain expenditures. Contingencies will happen, we know that. But all contingencies are not likely to happen in one given year. Pooling the contingency funds ensures adequate funding for the issue at hand, and by providing an established ongoing contribution, it would help to replenish that balance. Minimizing target levels. Looking at what our target needs are holistically across the city. Providing the opportunity to prioritize needs as a whole rather than in silos. And reducing administration. There are 3 consolidations that are before you today. The Capital Reserve Fund consolidation is the first, taking our existing Capital Reserve Fund, as well as 75% of the Uptown Development Reserve Fund, and consolidating those two into a new Capital Reserve Fund that would be used only for new assets, the city portion of growth-related projects and studies. The second consolidation for your consideration today is the Capital Infrastructure Reinvestment Reserve consolidation. This would be using our Protective Services Reserve Fund, our Computer Equipment and Photocopier Replacement Reserve, our Commercial Property Reserve Fund, Facility Operations Reserve, our existing Capital Infrastructure Reinvestment Reserve Fund, and a 25% portion of the Uptown Development Reserve Fund, combining those into a new Capital Infrastructure Reinvestment Reserve Fund. And this fund would be used for the replacement and rehabilitation of all tax-based assets. This separation of funding sources for growth and rehabilitation will simplify tracking and analysis, and it will provide a clear distinction between the two for the purposes of our long-term financial planning and our capital budgeting and reporting. The third consolidation before you today is a contingency consolidation. Our Environmental Cleanup Reserve, our Facilities Maintenance Reserve, our Winter Control Reserve, Storm Event Reserve, the Workplace Safety and Insurance Reserve, and our Commercial Property Vacancy Reserve Fund, consolidated into a new General Operating Contingency and Winter Control Reserve. Many of these smaller contingency reserves do not have ongoing funding sources and sufficient balances, and this is not a sustainable model. By pooling these funds and establishing an ongoing contribution to the reserve, funds will be available in the reserve to address the contingencies that arise, minimizing the need to access the tax rate stabilization reserve. Should Council approve the reserve consolidation, what are the next steps? The long-term financial plan modeling is currently underway, and the needs identified through that process will help us to make recommendations to establish minimum, target, and maximum levels for the reserves and reserve funds, as well as to recommend contribution levels. The consolidated funding sources would then be used in the development of the 2019 budget. In addition, there's a number of other initiatives for improvements that are being considered. For example, staff are looking at how to better predict assessment growth. Staff are looking at aligning our development charge process with the 3-year budget process, providing the opportunity to consider and prioritize growth and rehabilitation needs at the same time. A standardized framework to help define the operating impacts of capital so there is consistency across projects is also in development. Reserve consolidation, while a significant change from our past practice, is the first piece in what is really a broader look at the way we currently budget. And it will provide us with the tools that we need to assist as we shortly begin upon the next budget for 2019. And that's the end of my presentation. I'd like to open it for questions from Council.
Thank you very much, Julie. Questions from Council? Councillor Whaley?
That was quite a presentation, Julie. Using the tool concept to describe this was really brought it home so clearly to me. It was a fascinating read, this whole consolidation report. I read it on the weekend. And long overdue, because as you said, we went from 49 to a much simpler number. The one that I want to talk to you about in particular is consolidation number 3, which is on page 51 of the report. And it takes 6 former reserve funds and presses it into one. And I'd like to, some of the thinking that I had on it is that I noticed that at least 3 of the 6 form are in one section, because the intention of it is to pool the risk. And that's the reason for the consolidation. But I worry in this case, in this particular case, if we're not compounding the risk. And the reason I say that is 3 of the 6 funds that are being rolled together have to do with, have a potential to be affected by climate change. I talk about the Environmental Cleanup Reserve, the Storm Event Reserve, and the Winter Control Reserve. So 3 of these 6 are in particular have the potential to be greatly affected by climate change, and the fact that we have put them all in one basket to pool the risk. I worry that severe climatic events, because of these 3 being in one, don't in fact compound the risk. And I'd like your thoughts on that.
Through you, Chair Henry, to Councillor Whaley, I would argue that the opposite would be true. For example, the Winter Control Reserve has been drawn on 7 out of 10 years of the last 10 years, and there is no ongoing funding going into that reserve. If winter control has a surplus, it goes into that reserve, but otherwise it has a draw, and that's not sustainable. And the Storm Event Reserve, you might recall in 2013 when we had our 3 storms happening in 1 year, that's when that reserve was established. Since then, the Municipal Disaster Recovery Assistance Program has changed the way the rules would work, and we would need to have at hand 3%, or we would need to incur 3% of the municipal tax levy in cost before we could apply for a grant to assist in recovery of any of those costs. And that's the equivalent of about $2 million. So the Storm Event Reserve does not have that. That's an awful lot to put aside for one specific item to potentially sit idle for a number of years. And I think what this does is it leaves funds available, significant funds available for whatever contingency happens to arise. And by adding a ongoing funding source, you're allowing it to be drawn down in 1 year, but it rebuilds. And I think it actually puts us in a better position.
And I'll go around, but Julie, just to build on that, when we go back to the puzzle piece toolkit, one of the things that I understand is none of this consolidation is changing any of the inputs in terms of budget transfers or the rest. They'll follow wherever the consolidation goes and stand pat for now. But staff's working on whether those are the right numbers and whether they need to be increased, decreased, or moved around. Can you speak to timing around when we might expect to see that back, and that might also address some of the concerns that Councillor Whaley is, I think, rightly raising, that we've got some increasing risk in some of these areas, and maybe our budgets aren't as aligned as we need them to be to fund these contingencies.
Through you, Chair Henry. Yes, so through the long-term financial plan modeling, we're running a number of different scenarios. We have our needs identified. Now we need to figure out how we're going to address those needs. And there's a number of different approaches that we can take. And so we're running a number of different scenarios that will help to feed into what our appropriate reserve levels should be. And those minimums, those targets, those maximums, and the contribution levels, we're hoping to report back on through the long-term financial plan report, which is scheduled right now for April.
Thank you very much. I had Councillor Durrell, then Councillor Maven, and Councillor Freeman.
Thank you, Councillor Henry. The Uptown Reserve is the recommendation is to close it. I'm wondering why did we start that Uptown Reserve?
It's been around since my time here, so it predates me. I'm not sure on what the initial.
I'll look to Mr. Rapp.
Certainly, through Chair Henry. The initial establishment of that reserve was to help bury hydro underground in the uptown. So we were receiving monies from Waterloo North Hydro. We were putting it in that reserve to help with the cost of that. That was the original intent, and then a couple of years ago, through policy and the budget process, it was opened up.
May I ask a couple questions? Thank you. Through Chair Henry, do you know some of the programs that, maybe this is to Cam again, that we have funded through the Uptown Reserve? So I know we did bury the hydro lines when it came to the barrel yards, but there have been other projects that have happened through it.
Through you, Chair Henry, to Councillor Durrell, Uptown Community Improvement plans and studies, Uptown Streetscape Enhancement and Underground, King Street, parking north of Herb, Caroline Street Hydro Burial are some of the more recent ones.
Thank you. And can you tell me then, as far as this capital reserve that is being proposed to move the money into, would all of these programs be funded through that then? If we were going back in time, would it be covered under those?
Through you, Chair Henry, to Councillor Durrell. Sorry.
It's okay.
Durrell. The 10-year projection for our capital projects for the Uptown Reserve would then be split between the Capital Reserve Fund and the Capital Infrastructure Reinvestment Reserve Fund. So no changes to the budgeted projects are anticipated. We're still looking at the same types of things. It would just be through the new funding source is the intent. Historically, I mean, I would think that the same sorts of decisions would have been made. Whether it was a growth project or a rehabilitation project, it would have just gone through
I see Ms. Patel behind you, Councillor Durrell, looking to add on to that response.
Through you, Chair Henry, to answer the question from Councillor Durrell. When this report was done, Julie took a forward-looking approach. So we looked at the capital programs and the projects that are planned in the next 10 years, and those that are to be funded from this Uptown Development Reserve Fund. So taking those into account, that's how the split was determined to be 75% to CRF and 25% to the Infrastructure Reinvestment Reserve Fund. The intent being that whatever is budgeted continues to be funded in the future. It will go through the whole budget process again. There could be some reprioritization, but this reserve consolidation is not intended to change the funding of existing projects at all. So ours was more a forward-looking approach to say, what are the projects that we still intend to do from this reserve, and how do we maintain the funding for that?
Thank you, Julie. This might be for Keshwar, but one of the things that always interested me, and it's one of the questions I often ask other downtown, or mostly downtown, other councillors, was that we had this specific reserve for our core, really showing that it's a priority. And I understand that we had a lot of reserves. I get that. And I think that for the most part, I think this putting them together makes a ton of sense. But is this something that you see in a lot of other cities where they have a core specifically, a reserve specifically for their core, so that there is funding when needed?
Through your Chair, Henry, there is no standard practice. I can certainly say that some cities have a specific reserve for economic development, and that is often used for initiatives in the uptown or for other areas that need some economic stimulus. So it depends on what the strategic priorities are for council. This is not necessarily a financial practice that would be established amongst cities, it is more a function of what the city's strategic plan is. I would point that out.
Thank you very much. I have Councillor Maven, then Councillor Freeman.
Thank you, Chair Henry. Hey, Julie. I'm coming at the winter reserve issue the same as Councillor Whaley. I have the same concerns as far as there's no funding going in. The one-time expenditures related to environmental cleanup and storm events, those are one-time in nature. But winter control is an ongoing operating cost to the city. And if we've been drawing down 7 times out of 10 years, something's not working right on the operating budget side, because the operating budget should have been increased to offset that drawdown. Excuse me. So I'm seeing that as being, should still be separated. And I still see that as being a sort of performance measure, if you will, of the operating budget and how much we're providing for winter maintenance. Secondly, names mean things. And in this case, we have a new general operating contingency, which is great. Great. Nothing wrong with consolidation. But then we also entitled it Winter Control Reserve. We live in Canada. Chances of having winter is just 99%, in Ontario at least. So if, for a while, it doesn't make sense not to have a winter control reserve, first of all. Secondly, if you're going to have the name in there, why not just keep it separate? There are about 3 questions in there, Julie. Sorry about that.
Through you, Chair Henry, to Councillor Maven. The intent was that we still wanted to show that that we are aware that winter control is a significant part of our operating expense, and that it does occur every year. We don't always have to draw on the reserve every year, but yes, for a significant amount of them we do, 7 out of 10 years, as I said previously. But the winter control reserve as it exists now does not have an ongoing funding source to it. And if anything, I think that by consolidating them and by providing that we are making that reserve and the other ones that we are consolidating into it are more stable.
And if I may, I think it does have a funding source. It's the operating budget. And if we still use best 5 years, 5-year average for,
yes, we do.
For winter, so on the average, we should have worked out. And what it means is the 5-year average and the operating budget isn't working. Is that fair?
Through you, Chair Henry, to Councillor Maven. It's fair, and it's something that we would be looking at as well going into the 2019 cycle, if that is something that needs to be looked at. But I think that as far as the reserve consolidation goes, that this is a good approach, and that needs to be looked at through the budget as well, the operating piece.
And I see it the other way around. I see it as the winter control reserve being separate. And as far as best practices in Canada, or at least Ontario, I would think every municipality probably has something similar to this. And it's a benchmark to say, listen, are we really providing enough in the operating budget? But can I move on to other things? Or okay. We'll come back to that, okay, Julie? Page 67. Tell you what, let's go to page 53 of the agenda. This is more of a housekeeping curiosity question. We changed the policy on unspent funds for certain reserve funds, but we haven't done it for water and sewage, because I look at that graph and that's scary. But I know that the unspent amount in water and sewer is very significant and probably brings that line way back up. But why didn't we do water and sewer too?
Through you, Chair Henry, to Councillor.
In the graph, sorry, in the graph.
If you could let me know which page of the report that you're looking at.
Page 12 of the report, page 53 of the agenda.
Just to clarify that I'm on the right page, this is the page that you're referring to?
You're talking to a blind man, Julie.
Oh.
I'd agree that those are the numbers I'm hearing Councillor Maven say, so it sounds possible. This is the reserve and reserve fund, graph over time, Councillor Maven, correct?
Yes, total reserve funds, yes.
Okay. And your question was specifically in regards to the water and sewer portion?
Right, we changed and removed the unspent portions. It appears to be, we changed the accounting policy, but we didn't do it for water and sewer. So the unspent funds are returned to the reserve fund.
Oh, I see, okay.
Yeah.
Through you, Chair Henry, to Councillor Maven, the obligatory reserve funds are the ones that we have an accounting entry that takes place at year end. So that impacts our parkland dedication, our gas tax, and our development charges, as well as building if there are projects out there that funding gets returned. It's only for obligatory reserve funds, and that was at the recommendation of our auditor. And I'm not sure if Paul is here. If Paul could provide some additional detail, but this was an auditor request on how to handle our obligatory reserve funds.
Through you, Chair Henry, to Councillor Maven. Yes, to confuse things a little bit, for auditing purposes, the obligatory reserves aren't really considered reserves; they're considered deferred revenue, and therefore any projects funded from them, the revenue isn't considered to be earned until the project money is spent. So we're required to roll that back to the reserve or deferred revenue each year end. And then they get the funds back on January 1st to complete their project work.
Okay, that include parkland dedication too?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
There's certainly been some legislative updates in the world of parkland dedication as well to really tighten how municipalities account for and report on these, that causes their staff all sorts of extra work that they love to do for the province. I know you've got a few more, Councillor Maven.
Yes, just a few more. Some of them are just housekeeping. Page 67 of the agenda, page 26 of the report. I had a conversation with, through you, Chair Henry, with Chair Henry just prior to council, and he explained that this is just the way the DC bylaw works right now. But it's a little bit scary because right now this reserve projection shows at the end of 2018, which of course is this year, we've got a deficit of $20 million if certain projects go ahead. Now when I look at the certain projects, one of them I see is the Silver Lake EA. Does that mean we're not going to do it? I don't know Julie, I don't know how to interpret this significant negative balance that's so close to coming. It's what, 11 months away?
Through you, Chair Henry, to Councillor Maven. Yes, the deficit in the DC reserve funds is really attributable to 5 projects that have been scheduled in 2018. So there's an initial outlay that is projected. We know that the full amount of for Beaver Creek, for example, the $39 million is not all going to be needed in 2018. So we will be working with the implementation divisions for these projects to do a cash flow release of funds on these projects. I have 5 projects listed within the report. So there's the Beaver Creek Uptown Parking Expansion, the West Side, Silver Lake, and Iron Needles. Silver Lake, there's also a debenture funding that also that partially offsets some of that $6.5 million as well. So there's debenture proceeds as well to help offset that. And those debenture proceeds have been received. So they may not all progress in 2018 the way they are currently budgeted, then we will be working with the implementation divisions to release the funding.
Okay, and that's a good answer, Julie. Thank you very much. When I look at the reports, and they show on page 54 of the agenda the projects that are there, and I'm looking at the Uptown Parking Expansion. I was sort of hoping that would go this year. Silver Lake, I definitely was hoping. I mean, Councillor Whaley and the mayor are jumping in there on January 1st, 2019.
I think that's just Mark.
Anyway, sorry. But the Iron Needles Boulevard bypass, that one was very interesting. And I'd like that one to make sure that one proceeds. So are you saying each one of these is a candidate not to proceed in 2018? Is that what that balance is showing me? You calling reinforcements, Julie?
I am.
When you start asking about specific projects, I don't look to the FA that prepared the report. I look to the FA that's responsible for the projects.
Oh, I know how good Julie is. She knows.
Thank you. Through you, Councillor Henry, to Councillor Maven. Speaking from a bit of experience through the development charge background study that we just completed through Council's approval, as well as supporting some of the projects that are in this the report. First, talking about the DC bylaw and the DC legislation. So there's no stipulation in the Development Charges Act that we can't run a reserve into the negative. It's always been city policy to debenture a project to keep that reserve in the positive. So what will happen is we'll debenture a project and we'll pay interest on that's covered by development charges and collected through the rate. Or you could run the reserve into the negative and just incur interest charges within the reserve. So that's no different. It's really just the opposite of how we want to display it for our internal purposes. So the DC bylaw that we just completed uses our capital program, as Julie mentioned, showing some big project trading deficits in the next few years, but it accounts for that implicit interest in the development charge rate. So we're actually recouping the interest costs of these projects through our DCs that we're collecting on every permit that we issue. So that being said, what we're showing here is that we have a few significant projects like Beaver Creek and some of these the Ardennes bypass that you're required to build the infrastructure before you can actually collect the development charge. So we need to build out Beaver Creek before we can build the houses, and when we build the houses, when we'll collect the development charge. So that's why you see it kind of recouping at the end. And the study that our consultants do for us, they run these 15-year projections or 10-year projections to say, okay, here's your capital project, X million dollars. You now need X million dollars to recover that over the so many years, and they have our growth projections. So that was covered in our DC bylaw. And what Julie's showing in this report is those projects, how they impact the DC reserve without actually debenturing them. So what we could do is we could show debentures so that the reserve never goes into the negative, but doesn't really change whether the project's going to go ahead or not. So we monitored DC collections on a quarterly basis with CMT. We have an annual report to council. So what we're looking to do with some of these significant projects is monitor them, look at them on a quarterly basis and say, okay, does this project need to go ahead? Do we need to still do Silver Lake? Does the Iron Needles bypass need to move ahead so we can have development going down the road? Do we need to fund a portion of Beaver Creek to get some infrastructure in place to fund, buildings down the road? And it's at that point when we fund them, we're going to be looking at the growth projections and are we collecting back what we thought we should have collected? And if we're still in the negative, then that's when we'd have to kind of assess, are we building faster than we're actually collecting?
I see Ms. Reynolds looking to weigh in further.
Just to add one more piece, which Julie and both Mike have touched on, but for Beaver Creek as an example specifically, we have it budgeted as $36 million in 1 year. We don't plan to actually go ahead and release $36 million in 1 year, and that's a significant project, obviously. But to Mike's point, it's sort of a chicken and egg. You need to start in order to get the population growth. So what we're thinking on that project specifically, and this could apply to the others as well, is monitoring that to determine more on a cash flow basis what we need to release in 2018 and in 2019 to move on those projects, certainly. So to your point, Councillor Maven, not to stall them per se, but to cash flow them so that they're in a more conservative line with the receipts that we'd be expecting on a revenue side. And then in 2019 itself, we will actually be opening up the bylaw again for review and implementation for 2020. And that will be another opportunity to have a look at these projects and the other significant ones for council's consideration at that time as well.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. And I know that development charges, we could do a line of credit in this, and that could cover the financing and the balance and so on. But at this point in time, I'm looking at this figure of $20 million deficit, and there's still that policy, I think, maybe it doesn't exist anymore, that we can't proceed unless we show that we're going to have money with these projects, unless we show we've got money in the reserve fund. Is that policy gone? The development charges?
Through your chair, Henry, to Councillor Maven, we revised that policy last year to, we still do look at the balances in our collections and our targets, but we've revamped that to see, does it make sense? So if a project puts a reserve into the negative or there's a negative balance, the project is subject to management review. And that's when CMT will look at it to say, okay, this this reserve is going to put this project will put the reserve in a negative, but we need to build up Beaver Creek. We need to build that bypass road to spur growth. So that's when we are looking at those significant projects on a case-by-case basis. It's not a hard line that if the reserve goes into a negative that we're going to halt the project no matter what. So we revamped the policy last year to have a bit more flexibility, knowing that this is monitored on a quarterly basis by CMT and on an annual basis by council.
Right, and I understood it was monitored. The purpose of being that if funds weren't available, projects would be postponed. So it sounds like the basic policy is still intact. And at this point in time, is our staff saying those projects are not going to proceed, or some of those projects not? And I agree with Philippa that the 40 million for that may be, for Beaver Creek Road, may be the enough right there, and everything else will proceed. I just like some confidence that that will be the case. You can get back to me on that. It's not relevant to what this report is about. It's just information I'd like to know. Okay. Is that fair?
Fair, move on.
Okay. Well, Julie made a comment about the DC budget being a 3-year DC study. DC usually ties into the capital budget. Are we making the capital budget into a 3-year budget too? Is that the idea?
Through you, Chair Henry, to Councillor Maven. Currently, we do a 1-year budget approval, and then we do follow that up with a 3-year. And the intent is to align our DC process with the 3-year, which, if we do the math, that would mean that our DC study would take place every 4 years.
Okay, thank you. Page 148 of the agenda. We're into the housekeeping stuff now, so the people who are pretty interested in the accounting discussions, I don't have to worry about it anymore. Sorry, page 127 of the agenda. This is Appendix B. There's a quote in there, and I don't know what the change in the policy is and why it's here. You may know it right off the top of your head. But it says costs resulting, it's adding in expenditure definition to include costs resulting from infrastructure, emergency infrastructure failure or impending failure are also eligible to be funded from this reserve fund. Is that what was changed? Or am I just imagining that?
Through you, Chair Henry, to Councillor Maven. No, that was in existence already in the policy.
Okay.
The changes are that the policy is being broadened to encompass all tax-based capital infrastructure, whereas before it was restricted specifically to roads and facilities infrastructure.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Page 148 of the agenda. Julie, I don't know, page 20 of your report, sorry. And it basically says expenditures. And this one is just dog and, chicken and egg, I guess. But projects applying for this source of financing must be supported through a business case approved by CMT or council. I don't know whether council is at CMT level or CMT is at council level in this one. But it seems a little strange to have an or in there. Picky a little bit, but...
You're looking at the innovation reserve?
Yep.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Maybe there's some strata in there that, allocates who approves what?
Through you, Chair Henry, to Councillor Maven. That was already existing in the policy. We can certainly take that back and have a look at it. I think the intent was that it would go to CMT initially and then move on to be approved by council. I'm not sure if there's a monetary threshold there that was related to CMT approval, if that was why that wording was put in there.
Okay, and the policy, you can see it's a little ambiguous now. Where does it really go? Does it go to CMT or does it go to council? And I'm just showing off right now that I read the report.
And since that isn't a change, I'm hearing Julie say that's something that she can take back because we get one of these every year.
Yeah.
Both fund, based on the comments under the existing policy, both current active projects I know came to council.
Okay, there's 3 items, page 151, 152, 154. Has to do with basically checks and balances. It's on page 23 of your report, the first one. And we can take a look at this one first because the rest of them are exactly the same. But it talks about expenditures being approved by the CFO for the sanitary sewer utility, in this example, on page 151. And I'm wondering if it also should say, because checks and balances are good, they work. And if there should be plus the appropriate commissioner, which in this case would be the commissioner of IPPW, or the CAO would be more appropriate, just having it in one person's hand. That's just good management. And you'll see that in 152 and 154 as well for those reserve funds.
Through you, Chair Henry, to Councillor Maven, just to make sure that I'm referencing the same ones that you're looking at. You're referring to the water utility capital and stabilization?
I'm looking at the sanitary sewer utility capital reserve.
Okay.
And
that's the first one. The water utility capital reserve, again, and the water utility stabilization reserve.
So these are new reserve policies that were approved through the report last year.
Right.
But we can certainly take that wording back to have a look at.
Can I amend that here? Can I make a motion to amend it? Not saying that would pass. I won't be here next year, Julie, so, when the report comes forward.
I think that's something we can talk more about. We're still in the question phase, and I have hands still in my list for questions to staff before we put anything on the floor and deal with these. So.
Okay, and I thank council for their patience with me in going through this. Page 43, I missed one of my questions. Page 43 of the report. Oh, yes, okay. This is page 2 of your report, Julie. But it has to do with policy FCO15. I sent an email to Keshwar and Philippa before council, but my apologies to both of them because I forgot to hit send. And so therefore you didn't get it. Yes.
I think not hitting send is more than a technicality in terms of the word having sent an email.
So if you can give me an idea of what FCO 15 is all about, we're approving it, and I know it's been around for a little bit, but we're basing some of these recommendations and approvals on that. I want to make sure the context is still the same.
The staff are preparing the context for Councillor Maven's remark as recommendation 11 and 12 of the opening in terms of redistribution of funds to meet planned policies, just as we had done earlier this agenda before this item.
Right. Thank you.
I'll look to Ms. Patel, who's got her hand halfway up.
Through Councillor Henry to Chair Henry to Councillor Maven, I did send you a copy. It's credit balances policy. So it basically it is defined the process that will be undertaken to return credit balances within the capital projects to their funding source. That's FC15. I did email you the PDF copy of it.
Okay. And I can go through that. If I have any questions, I'll get back to you. Okay? Thank you.
Good. Okay. Next I have Councillor Freeman.
Thank you. I wanted to build on a couple of the comments that we've heard from Councillor Whaley and Councillor Maven with regard to the winter control. I think, and one of the reasons what I'm thinking of is that a lot of folks lately have been talking about snow removal on sidewalks. And I'm just wondering whether the timing of separating this particular reserve is right, and whether we should hold off on that if that conversation is planning to come to council anytime soon. Because I feel like that's going to bring in a whole new aspect to winter control that would not be in keeping with historical years, and I do worry about the fact that it's been drawn down 7 out of 10, and that that we don't have a funding source for it, given, like, recognizing the fact that that we have vulnerable infrastructure that, in the event of a climate change event, is going to be quite significant. And I don't know, I'm just not convinced that this, by rolling it into this, it actually helps us improve tracking. So I'm just, that particular one I'm a bit worried about. And the second one is with regard to curve. So that originally, as you said earlier, that it was restricted to roads and facilities. And the conversation around creation of that reserve was specific to the fact that we recognized that higher levels of government, namely provincial and federal, oftentimes brought in cash to the equation on a grant application, but it required cash in kind. It was construction ready projects, cash in kind. And it was my understanding at the time that we started this reserve fund specifically so that it would be a response to those elements. Now, when I read how it was that we're going to consolidate them, it doesn't appear as though there's a barrier to continuing to access these resources in that capacity. But I didn't actually think it was too bad of an idea to restrict it at that time, and I still somewhat feel that it's not a bad idea to restrict it now, because roads in particular are one area that I think people are highly critical of in terms of investment, and that this is a go-to place for it. So I'm a little bit worried about that. And I'd be curious to know how other members of council felt. And then the last piece is related to the library, and the fact that there's a plan to essentially close the reserve once it's empty. And I think it said there was no funding source for it. Is that correct?
Through you, Chair Henry, the Councillor Freeman. There is no ongoing funding source.
Right.
It did receive contributions from the Capital Reserve Fund.
That's right. So part of me was thinking that we should actually formalize an ongoing payment to this reserve. And the reason is because we can recognize the fact that we're looking to do renovations to the main library, but in 10 years' time, 15 years' time, I think it's probable to expect that either the main library building, which is aging, might need more work. Harper might be in a position to need some upgrades, and that would be physical capital work, not just collections work. And so it just kind of worries me, because I think that sometimes the library, when it gets rolled into the bigger reserves, it doesn't rise to the top as being in need as much. And by having this separate reserve and actually putting something into it, it really is saving for a rainy day in some respects, for specific to the library. So those are my 3 comments, and I value hearing from my colleagues and staff.
I would pointing council to page 83 of the package, 42 of the report, the last word under comments for the Library Expansion Reserve Fund. It says potential, first it says, following the completion of the Eastside Library Expansion Reserve Fund was to be closed. With the approval of the new DC background study, however, the need for expansion at the main library branch has been identified. Potential funding options and the status of this fund will be considered through future budget development processes. So it's not being recommended, as I understand, for closure at the moment. And exactly what you're suggesting in terms of the need to manage the future is being referred to a budget process in our immediate future. So hopefully that's the response, because I think that's exactly what you were asking. That's in your last comment, but I just wanted to jump in since I had it in front of me.
Yeah, fair enough. It's just not the way that I read when I went and read the policy. So fair enough. And because I would support that. I would support advancing that.
So I had Mayor Jaworski next, and I think we're going to need to get into some discussion since I'm hearing a lot of people defer to a conversation with the group we haven't yet had.
Well, interesting discussion on the Winter Control Reserve and interesting points raised by all of council. So today the Winter Control Reserve has about 600,000 or something like that. And one of the values of having it merged is the fact that if there's something that's a greater need, we could access that money. But what would happen today? So today, let's say it just snows and snows for the next 2 months, and we have to access that reserve, and we uses up all the 620,000. When we need to get 621,000, where does that money come from? Does that come back to council?
Through you, Chair Henry, to Mayor Jaworski, we've approached it two ways in the past. When there has been a need that has exceeded the balance in the reserve, we have gone to tax rate stabilization to access funds to help to offset that pressure. And then to replenish the reserve, we have had to look to year-end surplus in the past. As we know, with our budgeting getting tighter and tighter every year, that year-end surplus is not what it once was, and that funding source may not be open to us.
Because I do think, keeping it as a separate item, and in particular with what Councillor Freeman mentioned about the fact there's more and more citizen demands on expanding. If it looks like we have a $600,000 reserve, that's one thing. If it looks like we also have a $2.5 million reserve, then that becomes a different question, and people think it's all that $2.5 million is available to plow sidewalks and things like that. So I think that concern is valid in the in all of this, and for keeping it potentially separate for that reason. Just thinking aloud at this point. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we've exhausted questions of staff, notwithstanding that we may have some as we go. But what we have before us is a multi-page, resolution, which generally isn't uncommon with the annual reserve fund report. It's just that we have some more significant policy shifts than we normally see because we're undertaking a long-term financial plan strategy, and this is the first significant changes to come out of that to help us manage some of that. So perhaps what would be best would be to get it on the floor, and then we can start having some conversation about what to do with some elements of it. So I'll see Mayor Jaworski move that, and I'll look for a seconder, Councillor Freeman. Look for some conversation. I think what I'm hearing, we certainly had some conversation that we heard about, Uptown Development Reserve. We had some conversation about the operating contingency consolidation, particularly with respect to winter control, and I'm trying to recall if there's anything. I think Councillor Maven had some policy pieces in for what we were doing for FC 006, and I'm trying to figure out where that is in our recommendation. There it is, number 16. I'm just trying to flag for my own mind where the conversation may focus. So perhaps we might start with the operating contingency conversation and have some thoughts around that, and hopefully come to some resolution on where we're going forward, or at least a way to deal with coming to a resolution by voting on stuff. So Mayor Jaworski?
Well, I think what I'm hearing from council is the fact that for item number 4, the reserve policy with winter control in it as attached as Appendix C, I think we're saying keep winter control separate. All the rest can stay, it's just winter control doesn't get merged with it. That's what I heard.
So there are people saying that. I'll look around the horn for other commentary. I want to offer some as well. Councillor Freeman?
Yeah, I think for now at least I would like that. I'd like the ability to reconsider this decision maybe in a year's time or 2 years' time after we've had some conversation around some changing winter control, because it's not just sidewalks. We're changing the way that we're doing winter control and thinking about our trails networks too. And I feel like we just don't have enough data on that front right now to get a sense of that. So I agree with that. And I could be wrong, but I think we're going to need some guidance with staff on these recommendations, because perhaps that is contained in more than one recommendation, that notion of winter control, because I see something here that council approved. There's a winter control reserve in item 7 too, so I just want to make sure that we're in the right place and space when we move these motions.
Yeah, I think we can work our way through it when we make a decision. Let me weigh in with my own thoughts, which are, I think to use your phrase, Councillor Freeman, contrary-minded on this item. I agree with Councillor Maven's observation that, you know, if we have a 7 out of every 10 years we're drawing on this, what we have is an operating budget problem, because the 5-year average should take care of it on average. Not every year, but on average. And what reserve you draw from in the years up and the year down doesn't actually matter. What matters is that over 5 years on average you're at 0 and you don't have to draw from anything. So we have an operating budget pressure. It's not the only one. But that's one that we do need to deal with. I think the way council has visibility on that operating budget pressure is the annual surplus deficit report, on which we enumerate a number of items, of which this would be one. And whether it's packaged in a big reserve or packaged in its own reserve, we still see it, and it would stand if it's material. If it's $5,000, we're not going to see it pulled out separately. If it's $150,000, we'll see it, whether it's plus or minus. So I think we do have visibility under this new way about dealing with this, and we still have a problem to be able to manage through the operating budget that we see other reports that flag it, and we can deal with that. With respect to the potential expansion a future council might make to what we mean by winter control in terms of services, I think the early years of any new program, should any future council decide to do something in expanded levels of service, an existing reserve with no ongoing funding that constantly has pressure on it, that is a relatively small balance, is not going to do it in terms of managing the early days where we're not exactly sure what the expenditure is going to be. A larger, more robust reserve, which a consolidation would offer, I think would offer us better protection under those kinds of conditions. But that's a policy choice council would have before it. So if council chooses to defer, then council can do that. I think that the recommendation as printed in this regard does the things we need it to do. We don't lose visibility. Keeping it by itself or putting it in here doesn't solve the underlying operating budget problem, and I don't think any future expansion needs it to be by itself for us to deal with it. I think actually being together helps in that regard. So, as I say, I'm contrary-minded for those reasons on that one, but I'll look for others to express views, and then we'll see, and then maybe we move on to something else while we figure out how to craft motions around that. Councillor Durrell and Councillor Maven.
I think you make some good points there, Councillor Henry, so I am okay with the way that it's written. The one that I would really like to see remain is the recommendation number 6. I would like to keep the Uptown Development Reserve Fund open with it receiving money from the sources it was in the past. So I actually believe really strongly in this, and I think, I hope that council will walk down this road with me. I think visibility is a huge thing for Uptown, and having its own reserve, I think, says a lot to not only the community, but to our business community, to the developers, to our staff, to say that this is a priority. A healthy Uptown core, I'm going to change it from downtown to Uptown, healthy Uptown core is very important. And oh boy, I lost my notes here, but I think the purpose of this is really to get expenditures for development and redevelopment in the Uptown core. So what we're saying then with this reserve is it's keeping us on task and hopefully allowing development and redevelopment to happen, and giving us that base that we need to make it happen. I was going through a strategic plan, and it's interesting. We talk a lot about economic development and environmentalism and all those great things in the city. And, we need to have the heart of our city, we've all agreed, is our Uptown. And we need to continue to make sure that it's vibrant and it's prosperous. And this having a reserve that is solely for the Uptown, I think, is really important. So, I don't want to speak to what other councils are going to do in the future, but I would be very grateful and thankful to this council if we could continue to keep this at Uptown Reserve as we move forward in this one, just so that it does have that space to breathe if things do come up that it needs.
Okay. Anyone want to comment on that at this stage? And then I can keep going down my list. Councillor Burke, then Councillor Whaley. Oh, sorry. You're still back on winter control? Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll have to write some stuff down. Councillor Maven, go ahead on that one.
Okay, and the reason the Uptown Reserve Fund has funds in it, because we put funds in it. And we can put funds into winter control as well. There is no risk in maintaining status quo. The 3 reserve funds identified by Councillor Whaley, I think, serve the purpose without having to consolidate them into a bigger fund that has no real source of funding. There is a risk, if you will, and Councillor Henry, Chair Henry, you referred to the underlying problem. You put the winter control reserve in the $2.5 million fund, you're going to hide that drawdown that takes place every year because it's $2.5 million. The mayor referred to that before. It's $2.5 million. We can take another $500,000 out of there. For 5 years, you've hidden the problem again. Whereas you keep it separate, the problem is right in front of you every year when this report comes forward, if nothing else.
So I think I'll keep moving on to the other conversations. I think we are exhausted on winter control. I had Councillor Burke, then Councillor Whaley on recommendation 6 in terms of uptown development.
I'll tie the two of them a little bit together, and it speaks to Councillor Maven's point about visibility and having it right out there in front of you. I think that's a great number of these funds. The vast majority of people don't care about. I hate to say that because I know they're important, but they understand winter control, and there's an interesting point about we don't fund it. Let's keep it out front where it can't be hidden. And I look at the Uptown one through kind of the same lens, that it's an important part of the city, even if for purely promotional reasons on behalf of the city. It's there, it can be seen, and it can be used. So in some ways, I'd like the idea of, well, let's consolidate all this down, but Councillor Maven is absolutely right. When you put those little funds together into one big fund, it's really easy to hide things. And I think if we're going to have a system of winter control, for example, that works efficiently and doesn't involve us moving money around every year because we really don't know what's going to happen, I think it's good to have that in its own little place. And for purely promotional purposes, if nothing else, having that Uptown highlight, I think is really, really important. So as much as I like the idea of consolidation, it carries a danger with it too, not necessarily from this group of councillors, but from a future group of councillors. To keep things up front and visible, I think are very important.
Next I had Councillor Whaley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, as painful and as long as it's been, the transition of the Uptown core has really just begun. We don't know, for example, how the ION is really going to play out. The tracks are laid, yes, but we really don't know how the ION is going to play out in terms of acceptance and how it's going to work. We don't know how the station area planning will work out. We've got a plan, yes, but do we know how it's going to be implemented? No. We don't know about the north of Herb reconstruction and whether that will work out as our hopes and dreams will. Simply put, there's a lot of unknowns with respect to the Uptown. And I'd like to keep that specific reserve fund for the Uptown open and transparent for council and the public to be available so that we can pivot when needed as these changes start to impact on our citizens and our council and our community.
Looking for more on this item before I move on? Mayor Jaworski?
I think right now the way it's written in terms of the existing Uptown Development Reserve Fund, to me it's fundamentally unfair to get funding from the users of Waterloo North Hydro that's paid for all across the city in 7 wards, and to skim it off and to put it towards just the Uptown. So even just for that, I would need it to be retooled in order to support the continuation of this one. The way I look at it, we're all in this together, and I think we've supported Uptown, and we will continue to support Uptown. Everybody realizes we need to support Uptown, but to have, we're really one 25 square mile city, and having it all together it seems like the proper thing to do.
I note, as far as I'm aware, that the operating budget transfer for the Uptown Development Reserve on an annual basis, I believe, is on the order of $220,000. I'm seeing nods from finance. And so the bulk of the funding that it has today comes from the above budget surplus from Waterloo North Hydro. When in April we receive the long-term financial strategy and various target levels and other things, and figure out whether we're doing the right things in the right ways to address the big issues that we face, which were down in the foyer before we walked in, the $20 to $23 million annual gap in infrastructure, we're going to have to ask ourselves whether we're putting all the money that we are getting from the public in various ways into the right place to fund the right projects at the right time to deal with those big gaps, and whether we're going to ask the public to do more and fund more to be able to get the level of service they've come to expect from the city. I would be very surprised if we are in a position in April or in a future course where we continue to recommend that significant source of somewhat varying funds continues to go into the Uptown Development Reserve, or whether it is better placed in the Infrastructure Reinvestment Reserve to deal with our funding level gap. I know what I'm probably going to think about it when that comes forward in April, whether or not the reserve fund is separate or together, because I think projects will need to, compete on the basis of priority of a council that's attuned to the service levels people need and the amount of money that we have available. Uptown will continue, I believe, to do well, but I don't see it getting most of the money that it used to get if we follow the way our gaps in our funding are going to go to be able to deal with our infrastructure gaps that we have in the future. I don't see it. Council may. And I will have very strong things to say at that time if that's the case. So that's where I am on the Uptown development. I think we've had a good conversation on the horseshoe there. I'm trying to think of other items. Councillor Maven, I think the only other one we had was really recommendation 16 regarding FC 006, and you had approval authority questions on some of those. And I think maybe since you raised the concerns around the somewhat already approved policies on these various reserve funds and the utility, the question I want to ask on these for context is in terms of authorizing authority to the CFO. I'd look to our CFO for explanation as to why that's there, if that's sort of viewed as appropriate, and if not, what other recommendations she may have to help council in that conversation that Councillor Maven has raised.
Through you, Chair Henry, to Councillor Maven on the question raised, I'm more than happy if we add in that in addition to the Chief Financial Officer, it's also the Commissioner of the appropriate department, so that it's IPPW, or if it happens to be Community Services, it's that. It's fine with me to have a check and balance. Not quite sure as to the source and why we did it when we did it, but I'm happy to have a second signatory on that.
So I think that resolves that one. So is there anything else that I missed in my
Except that we need to build into the motion as well, to amend Appendix B.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have to figure out wording for that, but just, was there anything else I've missed now and from any of members of council for items that were raised here that we haven't discussed in some fashion? At which point I will start to look for the clerk for help on how to navigate the recommendations list we've had to deal with the differences that council has raised and managing that. So, Councillor Whaley?
Just in that regard, Mr. Chair, we really haven't had that much differences for all the recommendations. I think there was just two sticking points, the Uptown and the Winter Reserve. I wonder if we could vote on all of them and leave those two to be voted on separately. That might be a simple way to do it as a suggestion.
So let me propose this and see if along those lines and see if the clerk is amenable. I think as I go down this, we will need to say We may need to, in motions 2 and 3, we might need to just add the words as amended to reflect whatever we happen to do with, winter control reserve, because I have a feeling that that will carry the day, and so we will need to have those as amended, and council will understand that to mean changing names and sources. Same thing in recommendation number 7, the words winter control reserve will have to disappear. And I think the other place that I'm seeing it is just in 16, if we read sort of as amended with the understanding that that means the CFO change to, that as amended here refers to adding in the second authority, and that staff has just written that down. Madam Clerk can figure that out. Those are the only 3 places I think we need to change. Okay. So with that, I will recommend that we hold number 4 and 6 in the recommendation, since those speak most directly to the matters at hand. Let's see, 4 and 7 come to, who cares? We'll just do it this way. We'll take the winter control one first, so that's number 4. Then we'll take the uptown development one, second. And I know they're in the negative, but then we can do it all, and it will be correct. So, well, Councilor Maven?
Point of clarification, the Uptown Winter Control Reserve, does that include the environmental and the single event or storm event reserve too?
So what I understood from the general proposal is council's view is to keep winter control on its own, but otherwise undertake the consolidation as printed, though not everybody may agree with that.
Isn't that a friendly amendment then? So we don't have to, or how are we doing this?
Well, I want an opportunity to vote against that without everything else falling down. So I am looking for how to do that, Madam Clerk, because I didn't want to offend the other recommendations.
Through you, Chair Henry, I think it would be, as you indicated, it'd be easier to go through perhaps individually. It might be the best as far as lumping them together, and then we'll vote on that other separate one relating to the uptown, just on its own.
Yeah. Okay, so what am I moving first then? Because I'm not following.
I would suggest that maybe perhaps we go through each recommendation. That might be easier than trying to lump it together, because winter control reserve is as you said, indicated in a lot of the other recommendations. It might just be easier just to go through each one. Yeah.
Okay. Well, and because the appendices, the wording amends, but only if we do the other thing.
That's right.
So.
Yeah. So, or we could just vote on 4, 6, and 7 separately. That just relate to the winter control.
Okay, point of clarification, 6 is not winter control, right?
6 is Uptown Development Reserve.
Uptown Development, yes, sorry.
So if we take item number 4 first, if council says yes to that, what does that mean?
Yes, should council vote on that, then to agree to take out the winter control, then they'll get merged with the other ones that include winter control.
So let's have that read then, that council approve the new general operating contingency policy as attached in Appendix C as amended, leaving winter control as a separate reserve. Yeah. So that means that we wouldn't consolidate winter control.
That's correct.
I think that's the best way to do it.
So if we vote for this, we're keeping that reserve separate.
That's correct.
All right.
While consolidating all the other elements in the contingency reserve. Does that make sense? I think we did that globally. I'm happy to be that, having it done under the existing mover and seconder as amended. So on that item, all those in favor? All those opposed? That would be me. Okay. And the next one that we'll need to take is the Uptown Development Reserve Fund be closed and the remaining budget be transferred. I think I heard at least 2 people speak, for it. So
3.
3 people speak for. No, you're opposed to closing the reserve.
I don't want to close it.
That's right. You are opposed to closing the Uptown Development Reserve. There we go. So you want to vote against it. I think that's the easiest way to do it. So all those in favor of item 6? All those opposed to item 6? That's 3. That's Councillor Durrell, Councillor Whaley, and Councillor Burke. So that remains. And then I think we can take the rest of it as printed with the as amended and removing the words winter control reserve as appropriate throughout all of that. And we're good. Okay, so that's on the floor. All those in favor? All those opposed? Councillor no, 6 fail. 6 pass. Yeah, you are voting for 6 to be in it. You're right. Sorry, I was mishearing you. Yes. Okay, fair enough. Councillor Durrell votes against, and that takes us through. Thank you for working through that. I know when you have 15 different things going on at the same time, it's hard to manage, and I thank you for your patience as I tried to follow where I was trying to take you. So consideration of this motion given in our previous meeting, we have none. Notice of motion, I see none. Communications correspondence or from the region, we have none. Unfinished business, we have none. Any new business, Council? Councillor Freeman, then Mayor Jaworski.
I just wanted to, I jumped in ahead of the mayor kind of on purpose because I wanted to thank him for all the work that he spearheaded around the STEAM event on Saturday at the University of Waterloo. It was pretty powerful listening to the young counselor talk about her vision being realized through that STEAM event about encouraging more students to like careers in mathematics, sciences, and arts. And it was an incredible number of mentors, like professional individuals who work in science, technology, arts, and mathematics, engineering, arts, and mathematics, who came together to engage in conversation with these participants. And I'm pretty confident that we'll outgrow IQC really fast. But there was something special about it being by invitation to keep the numbers where they were. So it was a great day, and I really want to thank you. And I guess Waterloo champions yet another new idea, and how we roll it out across the province to other institutional areas, I think is worthwhile.
Mayor?
Thank you, and that was what I want to talk about, and thank you for participating as an engineer, and all the role models. We had 65 role models. They left all saying, wow, they got something out of it from the 100, exactly 100 grade 7 girls that we had there. So that worked out very well. I'd like to, certainly the city deserves a lot of thanks for the support of helping organize that, and the Institute of Quantum Computing was instrumental in organizing that. So worked out well. We even received a congratulatory welcome from the science minister, Kirsty Duncan. So she was excited. She actually wanted to attend herself. So I said, maybe next year. But anyway, thank you.
Any other new business, Council? Any questions, Council? Seeing none, I look for a motion to adjourn from Councillor Freeman and seconded by Councillor Burke. All those in favor, we stand adjourned.